Welcome everyone to the Hobby and Tech Warrior channel. J4 here, and in this video I've got something tech for you guys, specifically a desktop computer. Now, one of the types of tech I find fascinating happens to be desktop computers. They're made up of many different parts, like processors, motherboards, RAM, storage, video cards, and everything in between that you decide to add on. It is this variety and intricacy of the many possible different combinations between the parts that I find fascinating. It makes every new build feel like a fresh experience. Warning, just things to keep in mind while going through the build. You'll want to discharge any built-up static electricity from your body, as they can damage parts, as well as refer to the user manual of each component for more information. For this next part, I'm going to play the footage I got of each piece of the PC build and the assembly process. As a warning, you may find this segment long, but if you're putting together a computer and want some reference on how to go about it, you may want to take a look. So late 2017, my friends were feeling generous, and out of nowhere donated parts for me to begin a budget build. I was surprised, thankful, and ready to build, but times got hectic, and finally towards the end of 2018, I found time to get it started. I've had the PC up and running for a little over 3 months now, and although the specs may no longer be current, I've been finding the experience to be quite pleasant. So big thanks to my friends who donated the parts for this computer. They didn't have to go out of their way for this, but they did. I really appreciate it. Moving along, I found that the choice of enclosure to be quite good. It is a mini ATX tower form factor case with a clean and subdued look. Mini ATX refers to the largest size motherboard that can fit in this case. It's characterized by the medium tower size and 4 PCIe slots at the rear, which can accommodate 2 dual-slot video cards. The front panel is simple and has most of the I/O you would typically need, such as USB and headphone and mic jacks. Easily serviceable dust filters can be found all around the air intakes of the case for ease of dust maintenance. Tempered glass side panels have become common now, and this case has it too. Another feature I appreciated was the inclusion of a power supply shroud to hide the clutter of wires, making it easy to tidy up the aesthetics. You can also see that there are mounting points on the top for storage drives. Where the case fell short, I feel, is in the tight clearance for the mounting of 3.5-inch hard disk drives hidden behind the shroud. I decided to mount the drive at the bottom of the case to keep it out of sight, but for something that is usually a simple task like mounting a drive, there wasn't much room for maneuvering wires to it after it is mounted. To deal with this, I had to separate the drive from the case and connect the data and power cables before mounting it back. Footage of where I mounted the storage drive exactly is found later into the video. Moving to the internals, we start with the base component, the motherboard. It is in the NATX form factor, meaning that it'll fit in our PC case just fine. This board supports a single USB Type-C and a single M.2 PCIe slot for NVMe solid-state drives, a type of fast storage which we'll get to discussing later. A concern I initially had was with a set of holes in the motherboard not lining up with any of the case's standoffs, but after installation, the motherboard was stable enough. Next up is the Intel Pentium G4600 dual-core processor. The processor itself launched in the first quarter of 2017. It has 2 physical cores, and with Intel's hyper-threading technology, gets an additional 2 virtual threads for better multitasking. It's performed quite well in basic office work, web browsing, and light gaming, only encountering problems when multiple heavy loads are involved, such as during screen recording of a gaming session. In addition, it came with its own cooler that is sufficient for the kind of power draw and heat this processor operates at. Getting back to the motherboard, we installed the CPU by carefully placing it in the socket at the right orientation, and closing the latch down, allowing the socket cover to pop out on its own. For memory, we installed 2 8GB sticks of DDR4 RAM. These are from G.Skill, and I've had good past experiences with them so far. These ones are the Aegis variant. Among the selection, they were no frills but would do the job. Stickers are found on both sides for labeling, and a new trend I've noticed from manufacturers is that the PCBs are not being made entirely square at the base pins, possibly as a means to allow the RAM sticks to rock in place as they are installed into the slots. Depending on the manufacturer, the user manual will dictate how the RAM sticks are to be installed. In my case, I had to install them in this configuration, closest to the CPU socket and one slot apart, to take advantage of dual channel mode. Basically a mode that reduces bottlenecks between the CPU socket and memory when two same size memory modules are used. One component I decided to spend my own money on to contribute to this build is the use of NVMe solid-state drives, a type of storage solution separate from hard disk drives that are quicker and use the PCIe interface for even more speed. I did some research and found that the controller for the Western Digital Black Edition had been improved, the improved versions of which can be identified with the appropriate serial numbers. I had some prior experience with serial ATA solid-state drives and wanted to see if the use of NVMe drives would offer a significantly improved experience. However, if boot time is the only thing you are looking to improve, I found that there was no difference between the far cheaper SATA SSDs. Back on our motherboard, we installed the Western Digital Black to the NVMe slot, and this will act as our boot drive. Okay, with this we're ready to install the CPU cooler onto the motherboard. Normally, with the use of aftermarket CPU coolers, an additional step of applying thermal compound between the processor and cooler is required before installation. But as we mentioned earlier, the processor we were provided with came with its own cooler, which happened to have pre-applied thermal compound. All I had to do was to find the right orientation of the cooler that allowed me to plug in the CPU fan with the least slack as possible for aesthetic reasons, and then press down on the locking tabs in opposing pairs to lock it all down. For the installation of the motherboard into the PC case, we start off by installing the I/O shield that comes with the motherboard. Then we set aside any obstructions and try to align the I/O ports on the shield and the screw holes with the standoffs. After a couple of screws here and there and making sure everything is stable, it should be done. For the heart of the system, we were given a Corsair 450 watt, 80 plus white efficiency power supply, except that I decided to help out my nephew, whose PC's power supply had just recently stopped working properly. Until I can find a replacement, I decided that this was the perfect time to thoroughly test out one of my friend's power supplies, which we RMA'd or returned to the manufacturer for the third time already. The Seasonic 750 watt 80 plus platinum premium power supply. It's a little overkill and I believe the previous to be a better match, but for testing purposes and until I get a replacement, this is what we have. It is my belief that the failure to power on was due to a glitch in this model's safety feature. So far, it's been a couple of months since I've shot this part of the video and this unit has been performing flawlessly. The power supply is modular, so you should take note of the connectors you're gonna need and plug in the ones you will use accordingly. So we slip it in under here, behind the power supply shroud, and we screw it down with 4 screws. So for starters, we're gonna plug in the 24-pin power for the motherboard, and then we're gonna move on to the front panel I/O of the case. That would be USB, and that would be audio. Next up is another USB 2.0, These things you can observe from the motherboard manual on their locations if you're not certain. Next up are the activity lights for hard drive and power, as well as the on and off switch and reset. Moving on is CPU power. Depending on the motherboard, it can come from between 4 to 8 pin. In this case, we've plugged in the 8 pin. Going back to the problem with the hard drive mounts I mentioned earlier, you can see the mounting point for the hard drive I chose located at the bottom of the case. If you screw down the drive first, like I did here, you just won't have space to plug in the power and data cables. As I mentioned earlier, what you want to do here is have the connectors in place before mounting down the drive. One of the last steps we're going to go through before installing the operating system is the installation of the video card. What I'm doing here is preparing the case by removing two PCI slot covers to accommodate the dual slot video card. The video card we were given for this build is a GTX 1050 Ti by Galax, and it comes in white. It'll come with a driver installation disc and user manual. It's best to check online and download the latest drivers in case they've improved stability and optimized performance. The manual, on the other hand, shows diagrams detailing the various display ports the card offers and the location on the motherboard at which it can be installed. Also included is a 4-pin Molex to 6-pin Potentia adapter, which we won't be using. Getting a closer look at the card, it has a predominantly white appearance, which I think will contrast well with the dark aesthetics of the rest of the build. And looking above, this video card requires power to be supplied to it through a single 6-pin connector. Going back to the motherboard, we locate the PCI Express slot where the video card will slot into. If you're not looking through the manual, it is characterized by the long slot for add-on peripherals with a locking tab. In our case, there's only one. Making sure the lock is unlocked, I support the weight of the video card while I slid it into position, aligning it with the rear case slots we've prepared earlier. Once the video card is seated and I locked it in place, we screwed down the wing tabs on the rear bracket of the card against the case. If you are facing difficulty, try to have the case laid down on its side with the motherboard facing up so you have both hands to work with, all the while allowing gravity to keep the video card standing and in position under its own weight. After the video card is secure and well connected, all that's left is to plug in power and see if the hardware will post. If all goes well, the PC will display to a connected monitor when powered on and allow access to the motherboard BIOS. You are now ready to install your choice of OS and check the manufacturer for compatibility. Okay, remember when I said I couldn't get a decent recording off of the screen? Initially, they came out choppy and unwatchable, which I attributed to the processor being too weak to handle the job. Well, that is partly correct, but mostly wrong. A more powerful processor would indeed make it more efficient to manage the workloads between the different applications required to process a recording. However, it dawned on me that I could just tweak the settings until I got usable footage, which worked. Looking at the settings, I realized I could get less demanding files. For starters, the GPU outputs to my LG monitor at 2560 by 1080 resolution. That's ultra-wide 1080. 1080 HD footage in itself can be demanding to record, so I decided to downsample the recording to 1704 by 720. This is still considered HD but on the lower end. I also adjusted the frame rate of the footage from 30 FPS to 24 FPS. Not only does this lessen the number of frames to be recorded, but oftentimes I work with and output 24 FPS footage on my phone anyway, which meant I would not have any trouble adapting the recordings to my editing timeline. Going to the advanced recording settings, I can further tweak the file output to make them more manageable, specifically by changing the encoder settings to take advantage of the GPU hardware acceleration to handle the load, setting the rescale output to a lower than native resolution, in this case 1704 by 720, and adjusting the bitrate to an appropriate level. Although the footage may not look as pleasant while being viewed downsampled and at a lower frame rate, we should keep in mind the settings that are about to be shown and observe what the in-game FPS counters are displaying. And I can tell you now, they were pretty good and exceeded my expectations. First up is Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars is an MMORPG game that displays vast environments that sometimes involve intricate vertical characteristics. Coupled with the presence of mobs and players, this can tax both CPU and GPU heavily. Despite the fast-paced combat style, this game doesn't necessarily require Twitch-like reflexes to ensure attacks and skills land. As such, a dip into 35 FPS territory is bearable and oftentimes acceptable to the experience. In open world, the FPS can fluctuate greatly, but as demonstrated, was well above the 35 FPS threshold most of the time, sometimes even averaging between mid 70 to 80 FPS, and a peak of 110 FPS. In more confined competitive game modes, you may experience occasional dips into low FPS territory, but the greater average remained rather high, between 40 and 60 FPS in open areas, and upwards of 70 to 80 FPS in more confined areas. Battles remained fluid and playable, while FPS dips did not distract too greatly from the gameplay. In 5-man mini-raid environments called fractals, there can be a lot of things going on at any one time, but at the settings provided earlier, the performance remains strong, maintaining an average between 50 to 60 FPS in the midst of all the action. Next up is a multiplayer online battle arena style shooter by Blizzard, Overwatch. Oftentimes, shooter-style games are also well optimized, and such is the case with a game like Overwatch. Having set the video settings all to medium, we were getting a smooth 70 to 80 FPS all throughout the gameplay, even during the intense firefights. You'll have to excuse my first-person shooting skills or lack thereof, but investigating the behavior of the Intel Pentium G4600 and GTX 1050 Ti, you can clearly see that the game is perfectly playable in all medium settings. There were barely any dips, frame rates remained at or beyond my monitor's highest refresh rate, and visual appeal were all maintained. Lastly, I tried out Fortnite, which is a recently popular battle royale survival style shooter game in the time of this video's creation. Battle royale games are not your typical shooters that are well optimized involving small arenas. Instead, the number of players can reach up to 100 at a time, and like MMOs, the arenas can have vast distances that the GPU needs to draw. In this case though, setting everything to medium was perfectly playable. Frame rates were at a nice 80 FPS average, and even with AA or anti-aliasing turned off for smoother gameplay, I would imagine that the game operates well enough for players to immerse themselves quickly. In conclusion, I found that the recording of the gameplay demonstrated the capabilities of the PC quite nicely. The GTX 1050 Ti was able to run games at very good frame rates on medium graphical settings, all the while providing a good gaming experience. It also provided hardware acceleration for video encoding during the recordings. The Pentium G4600 processor did a great job providing resources for multiple active apps like games, document processors, software screen capture, and web browsing. All the while, the 16 gigabytes of RAM helped maintain the multiple open windows running smoothly, and I was able to cycle through them flawlessly and without hesitation. Apart from fast boot times, I believe the NVMe SSD needs a special mention here. It really helped the recording process thanks to the write speeds being faster than what a disk drive can provide. In consequence, management of these large video files when they needed to be sorted and moved around in the same storage volume also became quicker. In the end, I'm really satisfied with how the computer turned out. I was really shocked by the combined performance of all the parts, especially when it came to video capture of the screen. Thanks to my friends' generosity and this experience, I also feel like I'm better informed than I was before about the capabilities of components at the entry level. It was great, and I can't wait to make the most out of this PC. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.